Hi, I'm Norm Abram. Welcome to the new Yankee workshop. Well, today we're going to start building something we've been meaning to do for, at least 10 years. We're going to build a roll-top desk from scratch. Now, we found a beautiful antique not far from here. We'll take you there next, right here on the new Yankee workshop.
The new Yankee workshop features the craftsmanship of Norm Abram.
We're in Arlington Heights, Massachusetts today at the Old Schwamb Mill. We were here a few years ago to look at picture frames. In fact, they still make and restore oval picture frames here. When we were here back then, we noticed this roll-top desk in the office, and since we want to build one, we've come back to take a look. This belonged to Charles Schwamb, who was the owner of the factory here, and he ran the business. This was an important place for him to organize all the various bits of paperwork. There would be billings and ledgers. He also had a place to put stamps, a place for pens, and other secret compartments. There was also a bar along the side of the desk where he could put today's mail. Now, when he went out to lunch, he wanted to secure all these important records. So this roll top, which is oak, glued to a canvas with a lock, provided security while he was out. When he came back, he could just open it back up again and go to work. Now, looking at the lock plate, we can see that it dates 1893. That's a good assumption of when it was built. We do know it was built by his brother Theodore, who had another mill down the river that made piano cases. This is sort of classic roll-top desk. There were thousands of these built with all these cubby holes made with quarter-sawn white oak, wooden handles on the drawers with plenty of drawer storage, and nice panels on the side and even out on the front side of the desk. There's a lot of good ideas here. We'll take notes on some of them, bring them back to the shop, and build our own. Well, here it is, our version of the roll-top desk. I was able to get some beautiful quarter-sawn white oak for the project. One difference from the original, I made the field of the desk top out of veneer plywood and edged it with solid oak. That way the top will be more stable. I also used the same detail on these pull-out shelves. Plywood in the center, solid wood around the edges. Now, if you'd like to build a version of our roll-top desk, a measure drawing is available with the materials list, and you'll hear more about that before the program ends. When these desks were built, they were built in factories. They would cut a whole bunch of parts, stockpile them, and then build all the various assemblies. For instance, the side panels of the drawer case are identical. All the flat panels are the same size. The cubby is symmetrical on each side of the center. Every piece of tambour is the same size and length. And you're going to see us doing a lot of that here today. I want to start by building the case for the drawers. There's a side panel, inner and outer. And if I swing the desk around, you can see that there's also a back panel for the drawers. And I also want to build this center skirt. So I've spent some time this morning cutting stock. Here are all the rails and stiles for those panels. The first thing I want to do is make a groove to receive the flat panel. So I've set up my stacked dado head cutter for a 1/4 inch width, and I've set it so that it's just about in the center of my stock. I ran the sample through, then I turn it end for end and run it through again to make sure the groove is perfectly centered. But before we use any power tools, let's take a moment to talk about shop safety. Be sure to read, understand, and follow all the safety rules that come with your power tools. Knowing how to use your power tools properly will greatly reduce the risk of personal injury. And remember this, there is no more important safety rule than to wear these safety glasses. The rails of those panels have tenons that fit into the groove of the stile, and that's what I'm set up for here. I've widened the stacked dado head cutter so that it's a little wider than a 1/2 inch. I've installed the sacrificial board so it won't hit the metal fence, and I've adjusted the height to give me just the right thickness tenon. A pass on each face is all I need to complete the tenon. The most effective way to make the 1/4-inch thick panels is to buy 4/4 stock, split it in half with the resaw, and then run it through the surface plane. Okay, now I'm ready for a little bit of assembly. This is one of the sides for the draw case, and I'm just putting glue in the groove and on the tenon, and this is the rail that divides the 3 panels. There's 2 of these that set right on a pencil mark I've put there. Now I just slip in a panel, no glue on those, and then I put the bottom rail on. Now the panel, and then the end stile. Tap that in place, do the other side, and clamp it. Now you notice that this stile sticks below the bottom rail. That becomes the foot of the desk. Okay, we'll set this one aside to dry and build 3 more. Okay, well that takes care of the panels to make the base. Now let's build some frames to connect these panels. I've removed a couple drawers so you can see the frames. There's a frame under each drawer and under this pull-out shelf. It also holds the sides of the case together. I'm making the frames out of 3/4-inch birch plywood. I'm going to run a groove down the long pieces, and I'm going to make tongues on the short pieces, just as I did when I made the panels. Using the same type of setup I used with the side panels, the stacked dado head cutter and a sacrificial strip, I can mill the tenons in 2 passes. To assemble the frames, I'm just putting glue in the groove and on the tenon or the tongue. I just slip the pieces together and I'll clamp them in place. With the frame clamped up, I'm going to use my framing square to check it for squareness along the clamps and right here at the top, and that looks good. To further secure the joint, I'm going to use my brad nailer and pin it with some 5/8 brads right through the tongue. With the frame assembled, I can run the front edge through to give me a groove that will receive the oak trim later. Now I'm ready to work on the desk top. I have a piece of 3/4-inch plywood, which is the field of the top, and then these 1-inch thick pieces that are going to band it, carefully mitered at the corners. And I've laid out a biscuit slot at the miter and all along the edge. We'll cut the slots now. All right, we'll set this aside to dry and work on the top for the upper case. The top for the upper case is made out of solid oak that I've planed down to 7/8 of an inch thick. It takes 2 boards to give me the width that I need, so I'm just joining them together with some more biscuits and glue. Before I leave tonight, I'm going to sand all the joints smooth on our panels that we glued up earlier. And tomorrow we'll come back, do the rest of the milling, and put them together. Well, good morning. I'm getting started today rounding over the front and back edges of these side panels. 2 passes through a 3/8 inch router bit does the job. Let's look at the prototype again. I'm just going to slide the top out of the way so I can show you the joint between the side panel and the back panel. It's a tongue and groove joint. A tongue on the back panel, a groove in the side panel. To make the groove in the side panel, I've set up the stacked dado head cutter again for a 1/4 inch width, and I've set the fence the right distance away. I'll just run it through. Now I'm starting to make grooves in the side panel to receive the frames. Now the first groove is down from the top edge. It supports that pull-out shelf. For that one, I'm using my router, which is set up with a guide fence and a 23/32 inch bit, which matches the thickness of the plywood. I started the groove at the back and stopped just short of the front so that the groove won't show through. This is the only groove that I'll make with the router and guide fence. For the next set of grooves, I've taken a piece of scrap plywood and set it in the slot that I just cut. Then I have a spacer strip against which I'm going to now run the router base against the strip without a guide fence. I'll plunge down and make a cut across each stile, and that'll give me the right distance between the frames. Okay, now I'm going to move this whole assembly over and set up for the next groove. Once again, I'm going to move the piece down, except this time I'm going to go to a slightly wider spacer because it's a double drawer at the bottom. Okay, now for a little assembly. Some glue in the groove and on the edge of the back panel, and that just gets dropped in place. And then I'm going to run a bead of glue along the edge of each of the grooves for the frames. All right, let's put the other side on. Now I'll just add a couple 1-inch brads angled through to secure the case and the frame together. Now I'm ready to start working on these side panels of the upper case. I found it very useful to make a full-size poster board template of the side, showing all the various pieces. From that, I was able to generate templates, and here's one of them, which is the curved rail that runs along the front and the top. I'm starting with a 7/8 inch thick piece, and I just set the template on it and trace the outline. I'll rough it out at the bandsaw. Now I'm going to attach the plywood template, and you'll note that I've roughed the piece out about a 1/16 of an inch to an 1/8 of an inch wider than the template. I've carefully located some screws. These will actually fall in the groove of the tambour later, so they won't show. To make the oak exactly the same as the template, I've now come to my router station. I've removed the fence, installed a flush trimming bit, has a ball bearing on the top, and that rides against the plywood template, trimming the oak flush. I'm also going to use a pin, a pivot pin, just to guide the piece through. A perfect copy of my template. Next, I want to cut a groove in this curved rail to receive the panel. So I've switched to another router bit. This is a 1/4 inch slot cutting bit. It also has a ball bearing on it that'll ride along the edge of the piece. For the straight parts of that side panel, the bit setup is exactly the same. I've just reinstalled my fence to guide the pieces. Now I need to form tenons for the intersections of that frame. Once again, I'm using my stacked dado head cutter, the sacrificial fence, but because the groove is not centered, I'm now set up to do the narrow side. Later I'll raise the blade and complete each tenon or ton. I've just run a test piece for the thick side of the cut, and that seems to fit okay. Now I can run the rest of the pieces. I've dry fitted the pieces of the side frames together, and they're all set. I've also cut a couple pieces of 1/4 inch stock for these rectangular panels. Now I need to work on the curved panel. I'm using a slightly thicker piece of stock, 1/2 inch thick. Once again, I'm turning to a poster board template, and I'm going to put it across the grain, sort of diagonal, and trace the outline. On many of the roll-top desks that we looked at, we noticed that this panel was flat on the outside, but had a raised look on the inside. It's beveled so that it fits into the groove, and that makes the panel thicker in the middle and a nice decorative touch. That's why I started out with 1/2 inch stock instead of 1/4 inch material. I'm going to use my panel raising bit in the router to cut the detail. I'm not going to try to do it in one pass, a little bit at a time. And I'm going to use these pads to push it through, keeping my hand away from the cutter head. To assemble these side pieces, I'm using the same techniques I used earlier. A little bit of glue in the slot and some on the tongue or the tenon, and just slip the pieces together. For the last few minutes, I've been forming some tongues on some 3/4 inch thick oak. going to be using these pieces to trim the front edge of the plywood frames. Just a little bead of glue on each side. Set it into the groove. And that's all there is to it. The last piece of trim to go on the drawer case is underneath the bottom frame. I've installed a couple glue blocks. Here's the piece of trim. Just gets dropped on top of the blocks and then tapped up against the bottom frame. And I'll secure it with a couple brads through the glue block. Now I'm returning to the desktop, and I've rounded the corner with my jigsaw. I've also taken the time to round the corners on the top of the upper case. Now I'll sand them smooth at my drum sander. The first step in treating the edges of the desktop and the upper case top is to take a 1/2-inch radius cove bit and go along the top corner. The next step in treating the edge is to take a 1/4-inch radius bit and knock the corner off at the bottom of the cove. The same 1/4-inch bit, but with an adjustment to its height, takes care of the bottom corner. Now I can return to the side panels of the upper case. With them out of the clamps, I want to run a groove, which will become the track into which the tambour will run. To cut the groove, I have another template out of 1/2-inch plywood. I've set up my router with a collar and a 1/2-inch straight cutting bit. The collar will ride up against the template, and the bit will do the work. It'll take 2 passes to get to the depth that I want. Now over here on the workbench, I have another panel, which is the back of the upper case. Again, the construction techniques are the same as those that I used on the drawer cases. It's been in the clamps for a while. Now we're ready to take it out and sand it. Using my stacked dado head cutter set up for a 1/4-inch width, a sacrificial strip on my fence, I've just milled a tongue on the edge of that back panel that'll fit into the side. Okay, let's check the fit. That's good. Now you notice that I rounded over the top edge of this S-curve up to this point right here, and also I rounded the back edge. Let me show you how I did that. A 3/8-inch radius router bit is all that I need to ease the edges. Now let's connect the back to the sides with a little bit of glue and some clamps. With the top carefully positioned on the side pieces, I'm going to drill and counterbore for some screws. Here I'm using my 3/8-inch plug cutter and a scrap of oak to make some plugs to fill the counterbores. Now I'm ready to start making the tambour, that curved piece, the closure for the top of the desk. I start out by taking some oak and planing it down to 13/16 inches thick. Then I joint one edge so that it's perfectly straight and square. I've now set up my router table with a 3/8 inch radius bit. I'll make one pass, flip it over, make another pass, and that'll give me the half round that I want for each tambour piece. I want to keep the pieces of tambour in order as I assemble the piece. So the first thing I'm going to do is make a line on the end of the stick. And I'll keep all these lines on the same side of the tambour. I'm also going to number the pieces so they're in the right sequence. After ripping each slat, it's back to the joiner to true up the edge. And now it's back to the router. And we keep repeating the process until I get 29 pieces. Here are all the slats that I'll need, taped together so that I don't lose the sequence. And this piece right here is going to be the lift rail. And there's a couple machining steps that I have to do to that. First is I want to bevel the top edge at 10 degrees. Now with a 3/8 inch radius bit raised above the table, I'm going to round over the downhill side of the bevel. The lift rail needs a tenon on each end, which will ride in the slot for the tambour. I can make that with a couple setups at the table saw. With the rip fence pulled back so there'll be no kickback as I push the piece through the blade, and the blade raised to 3/16 of an inch, I'll nibble away the material on each face. Now I've raised the blade to a 1/2 inch, and I'll nibble away the material at the top and bottom edge. Now with my rasp, I'm just doing a little bit of shaping to make sure that the tenon will ride smoothly through the groove. For this next operation, I want to make sure that I have plenty of good ventilation in the shop. We're going to stick the slats to the backing. The backing is nothing more than artist canvas that we picked up at the art supply store. Instead of using a traditional carpenter's glue, I'm going to use contact cement. I'm going to apply 2 coats to the canvas, letting the first coat dry before the second goes on, and I'll do the same thing to the back of the slats. The canvas has had 2 coats of contact cement, and it's sitting on a piece of plywood. It's just about ready for the next step. On the plywood there is one straight edge that I've secured with some screws. I've held it back from the canvas about 3/4 of an inch. I don't want canvas on the tambour where it rides in the slot. Now what I want to do is secure another piece that's perfectly square. So I'll just attach that with some screws. Okay, now I'm going to take another cleat and just stretch the canvas. The test to see if it's ready to bond the pieces together is just to touch it. If it doesn't come off on your hand and it's tacky, we're ready. And one of the advantages to using the contact cement is that I won't need any clamping to secure these pieces to the canvas. I'll bring the piece up against my end cleat and against the bottom cleat, drop it onto the canvas, and then take a J-roller and just apply some pressure to make sure I've got a good bond. Once the lift rail is in, we start with the slats. Let me just check my numbers to make sure we got the right sequence. Again, up against the straight edge, up against the lift rail. Another thing that I like to do is take a block of wood and just tap on the slats to make sure they're not bound up on the edges. All right, that's not going to go anywhere. Now I want to cut the canvas away from the plywood form. I don't want it stuck to the form. Well, let's see if we can get it away from the plywood. Okay, I'm going to take off the masking tape and slip it into the frame. Now, one last thing before I try to slide this into the case. I found that when I built the prototype, if any glue got between the slats, they bound up. So I'm just trying to break them loose. These seem pretty good. Okay, this is a little tricky. I got to get it into both slots and try to keep it square to the case as I feed it in. Okay. That's great. We'll set this aside to dry and start working on some drawers. The drawer fronts for the desk are just flat oak, sized to just be slightly smaller than the opening. The bottom drawers are double drawers. I'm going to be using those for filing. So what I've done is taken two drawer fronts and joined them with a fake rail. To make that assembly, all I have to do is take two drawer fronts, the rail, and cut some biscuit slots and then glue them up. We'll set this aside to dry, and we'll make the rest of the parts. The sides and back of the drawers are made up of a 1/2-inch thick cabinet-grade plywood. This first setup is to plow out a dado along the back edge to receive the back of the drawer. Now I've changed the setup. I reduced the dado to a 1/4 inch in width. I'm now going to plow a groove in the side for the plywood bottom and also in the drawer front. I'm going to join the drawer sides to the drawer front with half-blind dovetails. To make the dovetails, I'm going to use my dovetailing jig. I clamped the side piece in the jig. I've adjusted these fingers for the dovetail layout that I want. It can be any spacing that I want. I'm going to use my router, which is set up with a small collar and a dovetailing bit. The collar follows the fingers, the bit does the work. After a couple adjustments and installing the drawer front in the top of the jig, I flip the fingers over, slide it in, and set it on the thickness of the sides, which is a 1/2 inch. And then I route out the pins in the drawer front. This jig sure makes it easy. Okay, that looks pretty good. Let's assemble one. Now these drawers are going to take quite a beating, especially these big ones. I'm going to be loaded up with a lot of heavy stuff, going to be opened and closed frequently, and that's why this dovetail joint is a perfect choice. There's a lot of glue surface area, but most importantly, the shape of the joint makes it impossible to pull the front off when the drawer is opened. Okay, now I'll just run a bead of glue down that dado for the back. And we'll slip that in and secure it with a few brads. Now for the 1/4 inch plywood bottom. No glue here, just slides in the groove. Turn it back over. Check the diagonal measurements to see if it's square. That's 29. That's good. And I'll tack it with a few brads along the back. Okay, well, I think I'll stick around long enough tonight to finish assembling the rest of the drawers, because tomorrow we want to finish up this desk. Good morning. I'm getting started today working on the pull-out shelves for the desk. They fit in this slot right here. Gives you some more additional workspace. Just a piece of plywood and some oak banding. And the first step is to cut some slots for biscuits to join the pieces together. We noticed that on a lot of the antique originals, these pull-out shelves were made up of glued-up boards with breadboard edges, and they often would separate because of the expansion and contraction. Hopefully this plywood will solve that problem. Now that I've got the side pieces clamped in place, I'm going to cut a biscuit slot that'll bridge that side piece, helping hold it all together when it's assembled. For the last few minutes I've been working on stock to build the cubby holes, and for that I want thin stock, about 1/4 of an inch thick. I resawed pieces out of thicker material on the resaw, just like I did with the lower panels for the case. Then I ran it through my surface planer. I don't know how you do this without a surface planer. You either have to have someone mill it up for you, or you have to find a friend with a planer. I brought out the cubby assembly from the prototype so I can show you what we're trying to build here. You can't have a roll-top desk without this nest of cubby holes, or sometimes called pigeon holes. Now the pieces are connected with either dado joints or rabbet joints, and I'll make those cuts at the table saw with a stacked dado cutter. Now I'm just dry fitting all the pieces together to make sure they line up. Now I've gone just to my saw blade. I'm making very shallow cuts, about 1/16 of an inch deep, and those will be for the vertical partitions, which are only 1/8 of an inch wide. These are the sides of the cubby, and I've clipped the back corner to accommodate the rolling tambour cover. With the saw set at 45 degrees, I've beveled the back edge of the top of the cubby assembly to accommodate that clip. I've also beveled the top edge of the back of the cubby assembly, and this is a piece of 1/4 inch plywood. I'm using plywood instead of solid material because it won't come and go. It'll be much stronger for the assembly. Now for a little assembly. I'm just going to use a little bit of white glue and brads. It would be a lot easier to build this assembly if these pieces were 3/8 of an inch or even thicker, but these thin lines make the piece much more elegant. The minimum thickness that I can get out of my surface planer is 1/4 of an inch. The vertical partitions in the cubby holes are 1/8 of an inch thick. To get that material down to the right thickness, I'm using this sanding machine. There are 2 belts. A coarse belt starts the sanding, a finer one smooths it up, and a large belt down here moves the material through the sander. Okay, that should do it. Now, the vertical partitions just get slid in place, no glue. This is an intermediate shelf that I'm just nailing to a couple of the verticals. Not much room for error here. All right, that takes care of that. Let's build a couple drawers. The little drawer couldn't be simpler. The grooves in the sides are just like the large drawers. It's joined to the drawer front with a simple rabbet joint. No need for a dovetail on a drawer this small. Okay, let's make some handles for the lower drawers. Here I'm using a vertical panel raising bit to start forming the profile of our handles. For this next operation, I've tipped my table saw to 9 degrees, moved the fence to the left side of the blade, and installed a sacrificial strip, and just beveled my blank. With the saw back to 90 degrees, I'm going to place that beveled face on the table saw surface and make a cut that's square to that bevel. Now running the piece vertically through the saw, I've just removed the excess material at the bottom edge. With my 3/8 inch radius roundover bit in the router table, I'm able to round over the top edge of each handle. A final pass with the 3/8 inch bit at the bottom corner finishes off the profile. We need 8 of these. We'll just cut them to length. Here I've scribed the profile on the ends of each handle, and I'm just cutting it out. Now we'll just clean them up on my oscillating spindle sander. To make a finger hole in the bottom of the pull, I'm using my 1/2 inch radius coving bit. I've also installed this stop block because if I was to try to bring it into the bit, it wants to shoot back. That prevents that from happening. I run it into the bit and bring it up to this layout line, and it gives me just the right slot. To install the handles on the drawer fronts, I made this little template so that I don't have to measure for every single one. Once the template is set in place, I just apply a little bit of glue to the back of the handle, set it in place, and attach it with a couple 1-inch brads. To ease the remaining corners of each tray, I'm just using a portion of my 1/4 inch radius bit. To make a small finger hole to pull the tray out, I'm using a 1/2 inch round nose bit set up right on the split of my fence. I drop it down on my layout mark, go to the second layout mark, and remove the piece. Okay, those are going to work good. Now one more element on the tambour top. I have to put these 2 little strips on the lift rail so that I'll be able to grab it when it's closed. All I'm going to use there is some glue and some brads. For the finish on our roll top desk, we're going to use a polyurethane because I want a tough finish. Now the polyurethane that I'm using is a wipe-on poly. It'll give me the protection that I want, but it'll also give me sort of a hand-rubbed look. So all I use is a clean rag to apply the polyurethane, a nice even coat, and I'll let it dry for 3 or 4 hours. Once the poly is dry, I just take some very fine steel wool and go over the surface. That'll get rid of any roughness from maybe dust that would have fallen on the piece. Once it's all steel wooled, I use a tack cloth to remove any loose dust, and then I'll apply another coat of the polyurethane in the same method. Well, 2 coats look pretty good, but 3 are going to look even better. Well, here it is with 3 coats of polyurethane. Now, undoubtedly, it'll get a little bit darker over the years, but this desk will be good for maybe 100 years of use. I now have a safe place to keep the important documents, and I can pigeonhole anything or anybody that happens to come by the shop. So until next time, I'm Norm Abram for the New Yankee Workshop.